Thank you for being here. This is the first in our series of Montana history in 9 more easy lessons. We did this last year with different topics and some different speakers. Some of our speakers are invited back. They did so well and were so popular last year. So we're explaining to Jessica that there's no pressure, but we expect her to be even better than she was last year. So my name is Kirby Lambert. I'm with the Outreach and Interpretation Program here. And like I said, there are 9 lessons in this series. Next week, we're going to be learning about the fur trade. So anyway, Jessica is the Review and Compliance Officer for the Montana State Historic Preservation Office, which is, of course, part of the State Historical Society. She's been with us for almost 5 years. She is a native of Minnesota, but a graduate of the University of Montana. And we're very happy to have her back with us again today. Thank you, Jessica. One more piece of business keeping that I knew I was going to forget. So if you're a teacher and you're doing this for OPI renewal units, all you need to do is fill out all this information here, and when this is over, we will send you the certificate that you need, and I'll just put this clipboard over here on this table.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. My name is Jessica Bush, and I didn't do this last year, so this year, hi, Mom. Had to do a shout out. She's watching from Minnesota, so I'm pretty excited about that. Like Kirby said, welcome to Montana History in 9 more easy lessons. And like he said, I'm the Review and Compliance Officer. I work under Federal Regulation Section 106, reviewing archaeological projects. And I was asked back to speak to you guys in this second round of easy history lessons to talk about pre-contact trade in Montana and the region of Montana and how we fit into the continent as a whole. I'm going to specifically look at the role that tribes living in what is now Montana played, and then I'm going to examine trade items that made their way into and out of the region. Before I get started, I wanted to address this question. Was America a wilderness? According to the Merriam-Webster Dictionary, wilderness is defined as a tract or region uncultivated and uninhabited by human beings. But we know that North America was inhabited and cultivated by people for thousands of years. We had horticulturists and agriculturists to the east. People had irrigation systems in the southwest. So by no means was this an empty land. This America as a wilderness is a myth that has been cultivated in American history. And it kind of led to this idea that Native North Americans were just part of these tiny little tribes that wandered around. They were Stone Age hunter-gatherers, and they just moved randomly about the vastness of North America. Early anthropologists, they helped further this idea by estimating that pre-colonization, the population in North America was around 1 million people, which when you think of the size of North America, that's not very many people for that big a space. This myth was really proposed by people as a way to justify the colonization of North America and the taking of land from native peoples. Recent population estimates based on ethnographies, archaeology, and statistical studies now place pre-colonization populations between 5 and 10 million people in North America. And the overall estimate for North, Central, and South America is somewhere around 60 million people. So quite a lot more than what you tend to think of when you think of early America. Unfortunately, we're probably never going to know what the true population of people in North America was prior to colonization. And that's because after first contact with Europeans was made in North America, not the colonizers, but like the Spanish and the explorers, people coming in, they brought their diseases with them. So between the 16th and 20th centuries, approximately, I think the estimate they gave was like 93 epidemics. I don't know how they came up with that number, but a lot of epidemics and pandemics spread across the North American continent. What ends up happening is by the time the colonies are founded on the East Coast, approximately 90% of the native population has already been killed. So we can kind of see how people get this idea that this was an uninhibited land because 90% of the population is already gone by the time people have arrived. So why is this relevant to pre-contact trade? Well, I wanted to bring this up because I wanted to dispel that myth of America as an empty wilderness with groups of people just spread far and wide. There were people everywhere. And this is going to help in our understanding of how the items I'm going to discuss were traded and moved thousands of miles across this country. All right, so you're going to have to bear with me. I'm going to make you learn some anthropology theory, but it's important to our discussion. So anthropologists and archaeologists like to have theories about everything, and of course we have a theory about trade. We all understand the basic concept of trade. You know, you give someone something, they give you something back. Pretty simple idea. And we understand how it relates in our culture, and it's definitely much more complicated in our culture, right? We have a monetary system. When we're thinking about trade hundreds and thousands of years ago, we have to realize that these were different groups of people, different cultures, and that there's going to be different ideas in their concept of trade versus our concept of trade. So basically, by looking at these theories, it's going to help us understand the larger cultural context that trade existed within. Three approaches are typically used when we're explaining pre-contact trade. The first one is a system of economic interdependence. This approach is based on a term called mutualism, which means a regular reliance on intersocietal exchange of complementary subsistence resources. So, here in the Montana region, that translates to bison hunters trading bison, which is a protein, to horticultural groups for corn, which is a carbohydrate. They were both trading something that they had in surplus for something that they were lacking. But as we know, with most human beings and most things we do, relationships are never that simplistic. Horticultural tribes, such as the Mandan, the Hidatsa, and the Rikara, regularly hunted deer and bison, and so they weren't reliant on traded bison for their protein. We also know that tribes like the Crow and the Cheyenne and the Lakota gathered root and bulb plants, such as the prairie turnip, and berries for carbohydrates. So now we're going to get a little more complicated in our approach. And the second approach that is used incorporates plain societies into macroeconomies. So you can see by the definition on the screen, a macroeconomy is a multiplicity of cultures, a single division of labor, reciprocal exchange, and social differentiation, but not stratification. What the heck does that mean? I'll tell you, I read that, I was like, that's a lot of big words. Well, let me break it down for you. Oops. Okay, so basically what that means is you have a core, and that's represented by this circle right here. And in our case, let's call that a village. And they emphasize a single economic strategy, which is growing corn. Then you have groups on the periphery of the core, which are the triangles. And they also practice a single subsistence strategy, which is hunting bison. But in this approach, you can also have semi-periphery groups, which are the rectangles. And these groups connect as collection points between both the core and the periphery groups. Similar to mutualism, one of the problems with this approach is that it doesn't take into account, again, that groups were not dependent on these other groups for their protein or for their carbohydrates. Also, macroeconomies include a larger trading radius, which means you're getting a greater diversity in the items being traded, and you're getting non-essential items starting to be traded, and raw materials. So you're getting items that aren't finished, but you're getting, like a piece of stone that can be worked later on. What happens when you start getting non-essential items in trade is that it leads to more complex systems of exchange and stratification between groups, which in the definition says not stratification. Third approach, which I'm going to base my presentation on and follow throughout this presentation, follows the idea that widespread trade in this region and in the North American continent was the result of increased conflict and then spatial rearrangement. And this was proposed by Susan Vihick in 2002. This incorporates trade within and between groups with different and the same subsistence strategies. It accounts for intergroup conflict. It considers a variety of items as trade goods, not just food. And basically, this approach treats conflict as a catalyst of social disruption that provides individuals and communities with an opportunity to increase their wealth, power, and prestige. This approach also provided tribes with a safety net in times of low resources, such as if there was a drought, and it provided a source of allies. Understanding increasing conflict fits in with what we know happening in this region in the late prehistoric period, which is about 1,700 to 300 years before present. I'm going to say BP for now on. And this increase in violence during the late prehistoric has shown up in the archaeological record. We have skeletal remains that show trauma, and we have fortified villages being constructed. The result of this conflict leads to spatial rearrangement, which is smaller bands of people start regrouping together into larger populations, and this leads to political and cultural change. Okay, thanks for bearing with me. Now let's get to the fun stuff. Okay, so we know from ethnographic and archaeological data that there was a pan-continental trading network that existed across North America prior to European contact. This network linked most tribes in North America to some degree with other tribes, and they moved these goods across the country. The map on the screen is one I created, and it's just a very simplified version of what this trading complex looked like in the western United States. So you have large trading centers that connected with smaller secondary and tertiary centers, and you can see they're marked on the map. And it was through these interactions between these different levels of trading centers that they created this complex web. Now, when I talk about a trading center, it's not your local mall. It's a little more informal than what we think of today when we think of marketplaces or shopping centers or that kind of thing. Especially on the plains up in this region, because you just didn't have the population density to sustain a permanent marketplace. So, without permanent marketplaces, trade and exchange would often take place at annual festivals, communal hunts, and trading fairs. I'd like to point out the two green stars. There's one here, and there's one here. And they're labeled on here as secondary trade centers and permanent. Archaeologists refer to these types of locations as rendezvous. And tribes would gather at these rendezvous points with the express purpose of exchanging goods with one another. They weren't permanent, and they weren't even always at the same location each year. They'd be in the same area, but they weren't necessarily in the exact same spot. And that's very different when we think about these primary trade centers, such as up here. This is where the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara villages are. And they were developed around more sedentary tribes that practice horticulture, like I said, along the Missouri River, or even fishing villages that were in the Pacific region, such as up here. So we're going to break it down and zoom in to Montana a little bit. Within that large network were localized trading systems that were specific to culture areas. Two of them directly impacted tribes that lived in Montana. The first is the Pacific Plateau system, which was to the west, and then we had the Middle Missouri system, which was to the east. Early explorers like Lewis and Clark observed and wrote about both these systems, so we know that they were well established by the late 1700s and the early 1800s. Unfortunately, by about 1850, these trading systems were gone. The complexity that we see, though, in these trading systems, even by the late 1700s, early 1800s, indicates to archaeologists, though, that these were well-established systems. Here we have the Middle Missouri system, which consisted of fortified villages. Again, like I said, the Mandan, Hidatsa, and the Arikara. And they acted as midpoints between the nomadic tribes in Montana and Wyoming and tribes further to the east and the south. At these trading centers, often they traded corn, beans, and other produce for dried meat, bison robes, and leather goods. To the west, we had the Pacific Plateau system, and this centered around the Dalles Rendezvous, which was an annual fall event on the Columbia River. At this rendezvous, items were brought primarily from the northwest coast and from down the California area, and also some goods coming in from the Great Basin area. Slightly to the south, and in between both these rendezvous, was the Shoshone Rendezvous. And this was a spring gathering where, so remember, they met in the fall, and we believe people met in the fall here, and so then they would meet in the spring after meeting in the fall at both these other rendezvous points and trade the goods that they had gathered in the fall. Also, because of the location of the Shoshone Rendezvous being in the Great Basin, it brought in another cultural area, and that tied in goods from California and from the Southwest. So like most things that humans do, it follows social constructs and our cultural rules and norms. One of the things that trade had to deal with was that we know right now of at least 400 indigenous languages that existed in pre-contact America at one time. And probably there were more than that, but we weren't aware of them. They went extinct before they were noted by early explorers. So to facilitate trade between people of different languages, they would develop sign language. And most people have heard of the Plains as kind of tribes are known for their sign language to be able to communicate. Groups would also create pidgin languages, which is basically a combination of two languages, really simplified so that you can just communicate the most basic necessities. There's two types of trade I want to look at. The first is individual trade, and individual trade tended to be gender specific. Well, this makes sense. If I'm going to a place and I have a bone needle and a hide scraper to trade, odds are a woman's going to be more interested in that than a man is. So it wasn't necessarily that you could only trade gender specific between both sexes, but that oftentimes what the goods you had were what someone of your gender would be interested in. There's also ceremonial trade. And this is a more institutionalized exchange between larger numbers of people, such as the rendezvous, which I talked about. So remember how I was talking about the approach that I'm using says that trade is looked at and was partially increased because of conflict. Well, that's also kind of goes against each other, right? I mean, if you have a lot of conflict, how are you trading with each other if you're being hostile to each other, right? So there were actually specific rules and ceremonies that ensured safe travel and trading between potentially hostile tribes. Washington Matthews was an Army surgeon posted at Fort Union in Montana, and he ended up learning the Hidatsa language and living with them for a while and wrote an ethnography about the Hidatsa Indians. And he described one such rule that I'd like to read to you. With the nomadic tribes around, they exchanged their agricultural produce for horses, and recently for robes. When the Dakotas saw a certain flower blooming on the prairie, they knew that the corn was ripe and went to the villages of the farming Indians to trade. From the time they came in sight of the village to the time they disappeared, there was a truce. When they had passed beyond the bluffs, they might steal an unguarded pony or lift a scalp, and then they were liable to be attacked. So, as you can see, he describes that there's this kind of landmark, this point, where they're coming in, you're safe at this point, and you can come in and trade, and you're safe to that point out, but then once you get past that, all bets are off. Ceremonies were also used, and they were kind of a more formalized way to suspend hostilities for the time. A well-known ceremony is called the Calumet ceremony. Variations are known through many different tribes in North America, but the essence of the ceremony is the same. Essentially what it did was it was an adoption ritual. And so they would establish fictive kinships between people of different tribes. So I'm temporarily adopting you, so now we can be friends, right? This ceremony also involved gift giving, so we're seeing another exchange of goods in terms of gift giving, and they would often smoke a pipe. And this is where you get Europeans coming in and seeing this, and you get this idea of this peace pipe, right? And that's where this comes from. All right, let's look at some trade goods. So how do archaeologists identify trade in the archaeological record? Well, basically what we do is we look for non-local items and resources that end up at an archaeological site where they shouldn't be. And by non-local, we mean that they originated outside of the known zone where the group that we assume created the site we're looking at frequented and where we know them to have gathered their resources. So I'm just going to go through this real quick. This is some resources in their place of origin. We have dentalium shell from the northwest coast. We have olivella shell from California. Obsidian came from Montana and Idaho. Turquoise from the southwest. Knife River flint came from in North Dakota. We had galena coming from the Texas Panhandle region. Pipestone from southwestern Minnesota. Copper and silver came from the Great Lakes regions. We also had pipestone coming from the Ohio River Valley area. Whelk shell from the Gulf Coast. And mica coming from Appalachia. So, as an example, using a tribe from our region, you would have, say, the Crow, and they would have bison hides and dried meat and tobacco and berries and pronghorn products, and they would have their porcupine quill work, and they would bring that to one of these rendezvous or to one of the villages in order to trade for produce such as the corn, the beans, the squash. They would also trade for jewelry, shells, baskets, turquoise, copper, and pipestone. So now I want to look at some specific trade items and look at where they're coming from and how this kind of relates to all this. The first thing I want to look at is the materials that were used to make stone tools. And when I talk about stone tools, I'm talking about projectile points, knives, and hide scrapers. And they're one of the best ways that, as an archaeologist, we can identify trade in the archaeological record. And that's for a couple of different reasons. One is it's non-perishable. This stuff lasts. We can actually find it. It doesn't go away. Also, it's one of the most common artifact types that we find. And what's great about the material for stone tools is we don't even have to actually find the tool to have an idea that trade was occurring. If we just find some of the flakes or debitage, which are kind of the remains that are left when you're making a stone tool or when you're resharpening one, and we see that it's a foreign material, then we know that someone had a tool that was made of a non-local substance. Also, many types of stone can be sourced, and that's important because we can tell where they exactly came from and see how far away they traveled. Listed on this slide are some different lithic materials that were used to manufacture stone tools and occur sometimes in specific areas. Working in Montana, there's porcelainite outcrops down in the southeast. Knife River flint, which I mentioned on the last slide, comes from specific quarry sites in North Dakota. And the cool thing about Knife River flint is it's a very specific material. And when we can trace it, it's actually been found really far away. They've even found Knife River flint in southeast Colorado at Cody complex sites, which is about 8,000 years ago. So 8,000 years ago, they were already trading Knife River flint to southeast Colorado. Quartzite is one of my favorites. Archaeologists are working on better ways to be able to source it, but the quality of the quartzite and the color can sometimes be an indication of which source it came from. For example, there's a large quartzite quarry down in Wyoming, and it's called the Spanish Diggings. And I love to say it's a huge quarry site, and I can't remember, so much rock was removed that when Europeans first saw it, they thought there's no way the Native Americans could move this much rock. So they called it the Spanish Diggings because they assumed the Spanish had come up and dug out all this rock, but it's actually a really old Native American site. There's also a site called the Ray Long site, and that's in the South Black Hills in South Dakota, and that's also a large quartzite quarry that I was actually lucky enough to work on in my younger days. And we attempted to do X-ray fluorescence to see if we could pinpoint the mineral signature of this outcrop. And so if anyone's interested, just Google Ray Long site, and the paper is up for free on the North Dakota history website. So even though we know that there's outcrops of chert and chalcedony and basalt all over, a lot of them tend to have some difference from each other. So using geology and color variation and the mineral and elemental makeup, we can determine where some of these items came from a little more specifically. A great example of rock that was extracted from Montana and used in a trading system, it comes from this is the Schmidt Chert Mine. And this isn't down in Broadwater County, so not far from where we all are today. This site is huge, it's 260 acres, and the features at the site include a mine, open quarry pits, lithic workshops, and camps. We believe that mining began during the Pelican Lake phase, which is about 2,000 years ago. So much rock was removed from this mine that the mine shaft itself goes back 14.8 feet into the bedrock. Now imagine, they're doing this without dynamite, without metal tools. I mean, it's impressive. So how do we know that they were trading? Maybe they just really like chert. I don't know. No, we do think we know because one, the quantity of chert being removed would have been much more than one group of people would have needed. Also, at the workshops and at the campsites, we found stone tools and debitage, like I mentioned before, that were made from exotic materials. Also, the Olivilla shell, which came from, you remember, the West Coast, was found at the campsites, and it was thought to have been part of a necklace or bracelet. So obviously they're getting in goods from many, many miles away. Sorry? What is chert? Oh, what is chert? Sorry, chert is, it's a stone, it's a really nice stone that when, I don't know the exact geology behind it, but when it gets formed, it works really nice for making stone tools and flint knapping. So out of all the stone sources that we look at in archaeology, one of the best indicators for trade is obsidian, and I'm sure you've all heard of obsidian. There's 4 reasons that obsidian is important to archaeologists and why it is a great indicator of trade. And that's because 1, it was a valuable trade item, so it was spread wide across the country. Archaeologists believe it's been traded as early as 11,150 BP. It's easy to identify. Visually, it's very easy to identify obsidian from other stones. And it's also extremely easy to source. So obsidian occurs when you have molten lava cooling really quickly. And then each source ends up containing mineral elements that can be identified using X-ray fluorescence. And basically, X-ray fluorescence doesn't hurt the artifact. You shoot a laser at it, and the different minerals send back a different signal. At least I don't know all the technical, but basically it comes back and it gives it an elemental and mineral signature that is unique to each obsidian source. It's like a fingerprint. So once we know the signature of an outcrop, if we're finding an artifact, say, in Iowa, and it matches, we can match that up and we know exactly where that artifact came from, even though it's 1,000 miles away. The great thing about obsidian also is that you can date sites with obsidian, even though it's a rock, and it's called obsidian hydration. So basically, if you're at a quarry and you're knocking off your stone, as soon as you expose it to air, it starts to absorb water. And again, this is a very slow process, but it creates a rim on the stone. And this rim can be measured and used to estimate a date, and usually it's along with other dating techniques. One of the best known obsidian sources out here in the West is called Obsidian Cliff. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. If you've ever been down to Yellowstone National Park. You drive right by it on the western side of the loop. Probably didn't even notice it. But this is a picture I took from when I went down there last summer. So I encourage you the next time you go down there, now that you know about Obsidian Cliff and Obsidian, that you stop and take a look. Just don't take any artifacts, that's illegal. But obsidian from Obsidian Cliff has been found as far west as the Washington coast and as far east as Hopewell Mounds in Ohio. We believe that quarrying at Obsidian Cliff began as early as 11,000 BP. It's a long time ago. I threw in this picture. I apologize, there's no scale. I failed when I took it as an archaeologist, but this is an obsidian point that was found on Forest Service land up in the mountains just north of Helena here. This point, though, wasn't sourced to Obsidian Cliff. It was actually sourced to Bear Gulch, which is a source in Idaho, that's just south of the Montana-Idaho border near Beaverhead County. All right, so now I want to talk about a different stone. We're moving away from stone tools, and that is argillite, more commonly known as pipestone or catlinite. Pipestone is an extremely soft stone that, when it's first extracted, can be carved with stone knives and typically was used to make pipes, hence the term pipestone. And these pipes were used by tribes throughout the country. There are several known quarries in the Midwest, but the most famous is the Pipestone Quarry in southwestern Minnesota. And I'd encourage you to visit if you're ever out that way. It's a national monument, so you can go visit, and they actually still let the tribes quarry pipestone there using traditional methods. It's interesting to note that only pipestone removed from the pipestone quarry in Minnesota is termed catlinite. And that's because it was named after George Catlin. He visited the site. The sketch on the far side of the screen is actually a hand sketch that Catlin did of the Pipestone Quarry in southwestern Minnesota. Archaeologists are currently working on ways to try to source pipestone, and they're using a method called portable infrared mineral analyzer. Sounds really technical. I'm sure it has to do with finding a mineral signature. Okay, moving on from rock, let's talk about shell. Shell is a great artifact to identify trade because, especially here in Montana, we don't have a lot of shell. So if you find shell, there's a good chance that it's not local. Now, there are local freshwater mussels in Montana, and we do find some of these shells at sites here in Montana, but the shell I'm going to talk about are very distinct and different from these mussel shells. The Olivella shell comes from the West and Gulf Coast regions of the country, and it has been found at sites in Montana and within the Great Plains region. In greater North America, we have evidence of the Olivella shell being traded as far back as 8,500 BP in the interior Southwest. And we also know that there was an extensive shell trade network between California and the Great Basin. Remember, that's where the Shoshone Rendezvous is, right? At least for 3,000 years. If you're lucky enough to get whole pieces of the shell, you can identify them to their species. And if you can identify their species, you can actually identify specifically where they came from, but that's not always possible. So, for example, Olivella Batica shell has been found in sites in North Dakota, and that only comes from the Pacific coast. So the three sites that are near the Olivella shells are three sites in Montana where we have found these shells in the archaeological record. The first one is the Schmidt Chirp Mine, which I previously discussed, and the other two are sites on the north part of Montana. One is in Hill County. It's 24HL1088, and that was a burial site, an occupation site that dated to around 11,100 BP, and they found these shells in with the burial. The Galata site is in Toole County, And that was also an occupation site along the Marias River that was eventually inundated, but that was inhabited at about 700 BP. So you can see, even between these sites, there's quite the range that these shell have been coming into Montana for several thousand years and being used by people. Oops. The second type of shell I want to talk about are dentalium shell. And dentalium shell is a long tubular shell, as you can see on the screen. It was typically collected by tribes on the northwest coast for use in trade. And in our region, a lot of tribes would use the shell to decorate their clothing and to make jewelry. You could leave it whole, or you could cut it and use it as beads, such as in this drawing up on the top part of the screen. The dentalium shell has been found at several different sites in Montana. I'm going to talk about two of them. The first one is called the Coyote House Site, and it's down here in Powder River County. And this is a really interesting site because it's a habitation site, but unlike the habitation sites I talked about here that were stone circles and teepee rings, this habitation site was a log cribbed structure, which we don't find a lot of in Montana just because it's made out of wood. It's not going to last as long as the stone circles will in terms of durability. And this site dates back to the Archaic period. They dated it to around 1483 BP. The second site where this shell has been found is the Hagen site, which is a late prehistoric village along the Yellowstone River. I actually discussed it in my first presentation, so if you go back and watch it, you'll learn all about the Hagen site. And this village was occupied between 500 and 300 BP. These are one of my favorite artifacts. So these are marine shell mask gorgets. That's a mouthful. A gorget, if you're not familiar, is basically a type of pendant and was worn around the neck and typically had 2 to 3 holes in it. It can be made of slate or shell. The ones that we're finding in our region and in Montana are made of shell. These types of mask gorgets are common in the Southwest and in the Hopewellian societies. And even though they're not common here, as you can see, each of these points is a spot where a mask has been found. So they're obviously coming up the Missouri River here. The one farthest east, or that's been farthest west, is here in northern Montana. And there's also the farthest north is up in Canada. So gorgets found in our region tend to be made of conch shell and whelk shell, which came from the Gulf and East Coast, and it made its way into the region via what we call the Hopewell interaction sphere. So remember we had the Middle Missouri system that was right in here, right? And I said it connected to the east. Well, one of the systems it connected to was this Hopewell interaction sphere, and that's how these shells and masks are moving up into the region. Another way that we know these items were coming from the east and being traded up into Montana in our region is because of the motif that we find on these masks. And these 4 masks were all found at different places in North Dakota, but you can see they have what is called the weeping eye motif. And this is an art form that's very common in Mississippian and Eastern Woodland Society art. Typically, we find these masks at occupation sites, burials, and sacred locations. If we find them at burials and sacred locations, they tend to be covered in ochre. Some of the mask gorgets have scratches on the inside, and some of them even have traditional plains motifs. And I know you can't see it up there, but the back side of this one actually has a horse and a human figure scratched into it. We believe that these mask gorgets started coming into the area in the late prehistoric. But there's still a lot that we don't know about them, about who brought them here and what they were used for. Mike Fosha is the assistant state archaeologist in South Dakota right now, and he did a lot of research on these mask gorgets. And while he was doing his research, he talked to 3 tribes. He talked to the Cheyenne, the Crow, and the Lakota, and talked to the elders to ask them about these masks. What he learned from the Cheyenne and the Crow was that they were familiar with the item, but that they weren't associated with their ancestors and their people, that they wouldn't have used them. The Lakota mentioned that they often use masks in healing ceremonies and that, they might have been associated with that. And what they would do is each mask would be used to heal one specific sickness or illness. And it could also only be used by a particular owner. So if the medicine man passed and he was buried with his mask, that would explain some of the ones that have been found in burial sites. But again, that's some speculation and trying to tie in tribal histories and knowledge into what we're seeing with the archaeological evidence. I put in this painting because I wanted you to get an idea to see how they were worn. This is a painting by George Catlin in 1834. He's actually a Southern Plains warrior, but I liked it because you can see he's wearing a shell gorget in this picture. And also, it's hard to see, but these necklaces that are on the other side that going around it are that dentalium shell. So just to give you an idea of what it looked like when people were wearing these items. The last item that I want to talk about that was important in trade are feathers. And we know from ethnographies and tribal histories that goose and partridge, crane, eagle, and swan feathers were an important trade item between different tribes. There was a lodge that was excavated in one of the Mandan villages that ended up containing remains of 20 plus different bird species. That's a lot. So what archaeologists believe is that the people of this lodge specialized in processing birds and feathers for trade. There was an intricate social and economic network that existed specifically around the trade of feathers, partially because they were such an important item. And this relationship really existed between the Mandan and the Hidatsa and the Arikara, the Crow, the Assiniboine, and the Blackfoot tribes. There could be huge demand and high value, especially associated with eagle feathers, right? Even today, we know that you can't collect eagle feathers, right? They still have that importance, and they were just as important back then. Eagle feathers would be used in decorating dress, for regalia, and ceremonial items. And part of the reason that eagle feathers are so important to some of these native groups was eagles were seen to come and get powers from the gods. And therefore, by having an eagle feather, you get a transfer of some of that power. It gets given to you. We know from historic accounts that golden eagle feathers were a common trade item to tribes in the Northwest. So think back to the Dalles rendezvous, right? We know they traded golden eagle feathers there, and it was an important item at that rendezvous. Golden eagle feathers were often commonly traded for horse. Now, granted, this is a little after, leading up to the contact period, but, we know the horse came into this area before some of these tribes actually saw white people. And so they would trade golden eagle feathers for horses, especially prized horses that they called buffalo runners. And this was a horse that was extremely fast and could aid in the bison hunt. According to one Blackfoot ethnography, you could sometimes, if demand was good, trade a single golden eagle feather for a horse. I mean, think about it, one feather for one horse. That's how important it was. And a good horse. So remember Washington Matthews, who I talked about, and we looked at hostilities with trade, and he lived with the Hidatsa. He also wrote about trading feathers. And I wanted to read to you a little excerpt that he wrote about feathers. To tribes less skilled than were they in catching war eagles, they traded the tail feathers of these birds, a single tail being worth a buffalo horse. Their principal standard of value was a buffalo horse, i.e., a horse swift enough to outrun a young adult buffalo in the fall. So we've talked a lot about trade in terms of giving goods and exchanging items. But it's important to remember that trade is just one part of a larger society and culture And so it's going to tie into other aspects of that culture. Trade itself had a huge impact on the tribes that lived in Montana prior to European arrival. One of these impacts was that it led to specialization, which meant maybe you specialized in growing corn, maybe you specialized in hunting bison, but it also meant some people specialized in quarrying stone, and other people specialized in catching eagles. When you have trade between two different societies and two different cultures, some of that culture and those cultural ideas diffuse and they cross. So even though you're just trading items, people were also trading stories and songs and dances, technology, rituals, and information. There's no doubt that the introduction of the horse into North America enhanced this trade system. I mean, when you think back to that huge web, yeah, that's going to be a lot easier to cross if you have a horse, right? But the horse did not create the system. The system was already there, it was already in place, and it was already intricate. The horse just added to it and enhanced it. We also know that trade fostered marriages between different tribes. This goes back to what I was talking about with alliances, and also improves gene flow. Unfortunately, trade also helped bring about the downfall of the system and the people that were using this system, and that's because it facilitated the rapid spread of disease. So we know that a lot of the diseases that impacted tribes who had yet to make contact with the white people were European diseases, but they traveled up through these trade networks. So I want to reiterate that it's important that tribes living in what is now Montana were not isolated. They were part of a larger system of interaction that existed throughout the whole country. Tribes were not, and that goes for all tribes, they were not isolated. They were part of a larger system and community. And luckily, archaeologists have partially been able to identify this trade network and these connections by looking at trade items found in the archaeological record, by looking at ethnographic accounts, and talking to tribal elders and learning about tribal history. Thank you for my presentation. Well, thank you for coming to my presentation today.